What makes someone stay when no one is watching, and how far can pressure push a person before something inside finally gives in? Before this night is over, someone in this kitchen will be forced to see what they chose not to see. At 11 at night, when the restaurant was supposed to be empty, someone was still chopping vegetables in the dark, tap, 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 slow and controlled, careful enough not to echo through the stainless steel walls. The dining room lights were off, chairs resting upside down on polished tables, the last server long gone, the bar light dim and fading. Everything looked finished. Everything looked closed. But in the back prep room, under a single harsh fluorescent bulb, a young cook stood alone, slicing peppers with mechanical precision, lining them up neatly, resetting the knife, starting again. No clock running. No manager supervising. No overtime recorded. Just repetition. Just responsibility. Just the quiet weight of tomorrow already sitting on his shoulders. Up front, at that same hour, the owner of the restaurant walked in through the main entrance, anonymous, hood pulled low over his forehead, convinced the issue was operational. Numbers. Management. Efficiency. He believed the answers would be found in systems, not in people. He had no idea the real story was happening behind a closed prep room door, and it sounded like a blade meeting would. Richard Holston had built his restaurant group by trusting his instincts. He used to say he only needed 5 minutes inside a dining room to understand whether a place was thriving or quietly deteriorating. Tonight, standing in Columbus, Ohio, close to closing time, he felt something he rarely admitted: uncertainty. The location was not collapsing, but it was drifting. Slower evenings. Lower morale. Increasing complaints about wait times and small errors that should not exist in a well-run kitchen. It did not feel like the kind of restaurant he had spent half his life building. So he chose the only method he trusted when doubt crept in. He came unannounced, unseen, unrecognized. He adjusted the artificial beard the production crew insisted on, the coarse fibers itching against his skin, uncomfortable but necessary. Comfort was irrelevant. Clarity was the goal. Inside, the air still carried traces of roasted garlic, lemon butter, and the faint smoky memory of a signature dish that had defined the brand for years. Stainless counters had been wiped down, but not meticulously. Cutting boards leaned upright to dry. A clipboard near the walk-in refrigerator displayed closing signatures, neat check marks, everything officially complete. Too complete. When paperwork feels flawless, something underneath usually is not. Then he heard it again, faint but steady, tap, 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 the measured rhythm of a knife striking a cutting board somewhere deeper in the kitchen. No one was scheduled to be here. Only a manager should have locked the doors and gone home. Richard moved past the silent dish station, past shelves of dry stock in stacked containers, toward the prep room tucked into the back corner. He had conducted undercover visits before, more than he could easily count, always hoping to catch the truth when no one was performing for ownership. But tonight felt different. Maybe it was the hour. Maybe it was the stillness pressing against the walls. Or maybe it was the subtle sense that something larger than poor service or declining revenue was unfolding quietly, unseen, beneath fluorescent light. He stopped outside the prep room door and listened. Tap. 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 Careful. Controlled. Persistent. Whoever was inside was not rushing. Whoever was inside was enduring. Richard eased the prep room door open and peered inside. One overhead light was on, harsh and lonely, and beneath it stood a young man with deep brown skin, shoulders tight, eyes locked on a cutting board. His knife moved fast, but strangely quiet, slice after slice, as if sound itself could get him in trouble. Richard recognized him from the employee file. Darius Cololton, 23, prep cook, hired 6 months ago. And yet here he was, in a closed restaurant, working like the next day depended on it. Richard stepped into the doorway. "Hey," he said, keeping his tone plain. "Did not mean to scare you. You are here late." Darius flinched, then smoothed his face. Yeah. Sorry. Just catching up." The chopping never stopped. Catching up on what? Richard asked. Prep work, Darius said. I do not like leaving too much for the morning crew. It sounded less like pride and more like defense, like the wrong answer would cost him. Richard forced a small smile under the itchy beard. I am new. They have me training on nights. Name is Mark. Darius gave him a quick glance. His eyes were tired, not from one shift, but from something heavier. Nice to meet you. I am Darius. You always do prep this late? Mark asked. Just sometimes, Darius said, eyes dropping back to the vegetables. Mark leaned against the wall, letting silence breathe. Then he tried again, casual. So who usually closes around here? I was not sure where to clock out. Mason usually, Darius said. He left earlier. That did not match the paperwork Richard had just seen, but he kept his face calm. You did not head out with him. Had more to finish, Darius said. Mark watched his hands. A slight tremble. A slow blink that lasted too long. This was not hustle. This was exhaustion. How long you been here today? Mark asked. Came in around 5, Darius said. 5 in the afternoon, Mark thought. So you have been here 12 hours, and you are still going. Started early, Darius corrected. Mark felt his instincts pull him toward authority, rules, and consequences, but he swallowed it. Tonight, he was nobody. Just Mark. So he softened. Look, no one is here. If you are tired, you can take a breath. Nobody is checking. Darius shook his head. If I stop, I crash. Mind if I help? Mark asked. Help with this, Darius said, eyebrow lifting. Yeah, Mark said, trying to keep it light. How hard can it be? For the first time, Darius gave a small, tired smirk. You ever cut peppers before? Once or twice. Did not go great. A tiny laugh slipped out of Darius. He handed Mark a spare knife. Just do not cut your fingers. We do not want blood on the menu. They stood shoulder to shoulder, chopping in uneven rhythm, Darius fast and clean, Mark slow and clumsy. The air loosened, just a little. After a moment, Darius glanced over. You are holding it wrong. Show me, Mark said. Darius adjusted his grip with a brief, gentle touch. Then the hallway behind them made a faint scraping sound, like something being dragged across tile. Both men lifted their heads, but only Darius went still, bracing, like he already knew what was coming. The sound came again, closer this time. Shoes. Heavy. Unhurried. Someone was walking down the hall like they owned the building, like time did not apply to them. Darius's shoulders stiffened. His jaw tightened. The knife stopped moving. Mark turned slightly, heart picking up speed. You expecting someone? He asked quietly. Darius did not answer right away. When he did, his voice dropped. Manager. The footsteps reached the doorway. Mason filled the frame, tall, broad, still wearing his jacket like he had never really left. His eyes swept the room and landed on Darius first, then Mark. They lingered on Mark with annoyance, then snapped back to Darius. You still here? Mason said. Darius straightened. Yes, sir. I thought I told you to wrap this up earlier. Almost done, Darius said. Just finishing prep for tomorrow. Mason glanced at the cutting boards, the bins of vegetables, the clock on the wall. It's late. I know, Darius said. I'll be quick. Mason's eyes narrowed. And who's this? Mark, Richard said, forcing his voice steady. Training nights. Mason snorted. Nobody told me about that. Guess it slipped through, Mark said. Mason stepped closer to Darius. You clocked out already. Darius hesitated. Yes, sir. Then why are you still working? Darius swallowed. I wanted to help the team. Mason leaned in, lowering his voice. You help the team by doing what you're told. You don't get paid to play hero after hours. Mark felt heat rise in his chest. He caught himself. Stay invisible. I'm sorry, Darius said. Mason straightened and finally noticed Mark again. You. If you're done, leave. This isn't your problem. Mark nodded. Sure. As he turned to go, he caught Darius's eyes for a second. There was something there that went beyond a bad shift or a strict manager. It was fear mixed with relief. Fear of being seen. Relief that someone else was in the room. Mark stepped into the hall, but he did not walk far. He stopped just out of sight, close enough to hear. Mason's voice dropped again. You know the rule. Clocked out means clocked out. I know, Darius said. Then why do you keep doing this? Silence. I asked you something. Because if I don't, it piles up, Darius said quietly. Then morning gets slammed. Then everyone gets yelled at. That's not your concern, Mason snapped. Your concern is your job. I am doing my job. No, Mason said. You're doing more than your job. And that's a problem. Mark closed his eyes. The words hit harder than shouting. Doing more than your job. A problem. Mason exhaled through his nose. Clean up. Leave. And don't let me catch you doing this again. Yes, sir. Footsteps retreated. The hallway went quiet again. Mark waited a few seconds, then stepped back into the prep room. Darius was standing still, knife resting on the board, hands shaking now that the moment had passed. You okay? Mark asked. Darius nodded, but it wasn't convincing. You don't have to do this alone, Mark said. Darius finally looked at him. His eyes were wet, but his voice stayed flat. I do. They finished in silence. Darius wrapped the last container, labeled it neatly, and wiped down the counter like muscle memory was doing the work now. Mark watched him move, efficient, careful, like every mistake had a cost he could not afford. When they finally shut off the light and stepped into the hallway, Darius grabbed his backpack from a hook near the exit. You heading home? Mark asked. Yeah, Darius said. Bus comes in 10 minutes. That late? Night route, Darius said. You get used to it. They walked toward the back door together. The air outside was cold, biting, the kind that wakes you up whether you want it to or not. The parking lot was almost empty. Mark hesitated. Hey, can I ask you something? You don't have to answer. Darius paused, hand on the door. Okay. Why do you do it? Mark said. The extra hours. Off the clock. Darius stared out into the dark. For a long moment, Mark thought he would brush it off. Then he sighed. Because I can't afford not to. Mark waited. I was supposed to be somewhere else by now, Darius said. College. Culinary program. Full ride. Mark's stomach tightened. What happened? Life, Darius said. Dad got sick senior year. Bills stacked up. Scholarships don't pay rent. So I deferred. Then deferred again. Then time just kept moving. So you came here? Yeah. Full-time hours. Or close enough. Mark nodded slowly. And the late nights. Darius gave a humorless smile. If they see me working harder, maybe they keep me. Maybe they promote me. Maybe I get a shot at the line instead of prep forever. Mark thought of the complaints, the turnover, the numbers on his spreadsheet. And here was someone giving everything quietly, unseen. You ever tell Mason any of that? Mark asked. Darius shook his head. He doesn't ask. Mark looked at him. And if he did? Darius shrugged. I learned a long time ago not to expect much. The bus headlights appeared in the distance. Darius adjusted his backpack strap. You seem all right, Mark said. For a new guy. Darius smirked faintly. You too. For someone who cuts peppers like that. Mark laughed, then grew serious. You deserve better than just surviving here. Darius met his eyes. For a second, the mask slipped. Hope flickered. Then it vanished. Surviving is what I'm good at, he said. The bus hissed to a stop. Darius climbed on without looking back. Mark stood there as it pulled away, cold seeping through his shoes, something heavier settling in his chest. He had come looking for operational problems. Instead, he had found a quiet injustice working past midnight. Mark did not sleep much that night. He lay on the stiff mattress of the small apartment the production had set up, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene in the prep room again and again. The knife. The silence. Mason's voice. And the way Darius had braced himself, like this was not new. By morning, Mark was no longer thinking like a guest. He was thinking like an owner who had missed something important. He showed up early, before the lunch rush, hoodie back on, beard itching worse than ever. The dining room was bright now, sunlight bouncing off clean tables, music low and cheerful. On the surface, everything looked fine. In the kitchen, though, tension hung in the air. Orders were being called. Plates slid across stainless steel. And Darius was already there. Same posture. Same focus. Different shift. Mason stood near the pass, arms crossed, scanning for mistakes. When Darius moved, Mason's eyes followed him longer than anyone else. Mark took his place quietly, chopping, watching, listening. Around 11:30, a plate came back from the dining room. Wrong garnish. Mason snapped his fingers. Darius. Darius stepped forward instantly. Sorry. I'll fix it. Mason's voice was sharp. You should know this by now. Yes, sir. Mark felt it again. That tightening in his chest. It was not yelling. It was worse. It was constant pressure. Later, when Mason stepped out to take a call, Mark leaned toward Darius. You all right? Darius nodded without looking up. I'm fine. You say that a lot. Darius paused. Then quietly, it's easier. Mark glanced around. No one was listening. You know, staying late off the clock can get people in trouble. Darius's hand stilled. I know. Then why risk it? Because if I don't, it looks like I don't care. Mark swallowed. And caring costs you sleep. Money. Time. Darius finally met his eyes. Caring is the only thing I have left. Before Mark could answer, Mason returned. Eyes on them. Conversation over. The rest of the shift moved fast. Controlled. Polite. But something had shifted for Mark. He was no longer observing. He was measuring. And the scale felt off. That afternoon, Mark stepped outside under the excuse of a smoke break he did not take. He pulled his phone out and typed notes fast, afraid he would lose the thread if he stopped. Unpaid labor. Fear-driven compliance. One employee carrying systemic weight. He deleted the last line. It sounded too clinical. This was not a spreadsheet issue. This was personal. When he came back inside, he noticed small things he had ignored before. How Darius restocked without being asked. How he wiped spills no one else saw. How other cooks leaned on him without realizing it. And how Mason never once said thank you. At the end of the shift, Mark caught Mason near the office. Hey, Mark said. Quick question. You ever notice Darius stays late? Mason shrugged. Some people like to make themselves indispensable. You don't worry about overtime. He clocks out, Mason said. That's on him. Mark held his gaze. And if it's not really a choice? Mason frowned. You saying something? Just asking. Mason's tone cooled. Look, man, this place runs because people do their jobs. I don't have time to babysit. Mark nodded. Got it. But he did not. That night, Mark stayed again. Not hidden this time. Just present. Watching. At 10:45, Mason left. At 10:50, chairs went up. At 11, lights dimmed. And at 11:10, Darius went back to the prep room. Mark followed him without pretending not to. You don't have to do this tonight, Mark said. Darius sighed. I know. Then why are you? Because tomorrow is worse if I don't. Mark leaned against the counter. What if tomorrow didn't have to be worse? Darius laughed softly. You sound like someone who's never been stuck. Mark met his eyes. Maybe I have. Just in different ways. Darius studied him for a long moment. Something shifted. Suspicion. Curiosity. You're not just a trainee, are you? Darius said. Mark smiled faintly. What makes you say that? You ask questions managers don't. And you listen. Mark looked down at the cutting board. Sometimes listening is the job. Darius nodded slowly. Then went back to chopping. But this time, he was watching Mark too. The next morning, Mark arrived with a different mindset. He was no longer just observing behavior. He was tracking patterns. Darius arrived early again. Not clocked in. Already moving. Already solving problems no one had asked him to fix. When deliveries came in late, Darius adjusted prep without complaint. When a server panicked over a missing ingredient, Darius found a substitute in seconds. When a line cook snapped under pressure, Darius absorbed it quietly and kept going. Mason noticed the efficiency but not the cost. During a brief lull, Mark leaned close. You ever take a day off? Darius blinked. I took one last month. 1. Needed to handle paperwork. Mark nodded. And sleep. Darius gave a tired smile. Sleep is for people who are caught up. The lunch rush hit harder than expected. Tickets stacked. Voices rose. Mason barked orders. A plate slipped. Sauce splattered. Mason rounded on Darius. Watch it. Darius clenched his jaw. Yes, sir. Mark felt it snap inside him. Not anger. Resolve. Later, when the kitchen finally exhaled, Mark asked quietly, what happens if you slow down? Darius didn't answer right away. Then, I disappear. Mark studied him. You ever think you already have? Darius frowned. What do you mean? Mark gestured around. They rely on you. But they don't see you. Not really. Darius laughed softly, without humor. That's most places. Mark shook his head. It shouldn't be. The words hummed between them. Dangerous words. Darius lowered his voice. You don't say things like that out loud. Mark met his gaze. Someone has to. Darius looked away. Careful. People who say they get replaced. Mark smiled faintly. Or promoted. Darius scoffed. That's not how it works. Mark didn't argue. He just watched Mason across the kitchen, laughing with another manager, oblivious. Sometimes, Mark said, systems break quietly. Until someone listens. Darius picked up his knife again. Then listened fast. That evening, the production crew called Mark back to the apartment. They wanted updates. Reactions. Cliff notes. Mark gave them facts but held back conclusions. He needed more than suspicion. He needed clarity. On his laptop, he pulled up employee records. Schedules. Clock-ins and clock-outs. Patterns emerged fast. Darius consistently clocked out on time. And consistently worked long after. No overtime recorded. No flags. No alarms. Mark felt something cold settle in his stomach. The next day, he watched Mason adjust schedules, cutting hours for 2 other prep cooks. Darius absorbed the extra load without question. During break, Mark asked him, "You ever talk to HR?" Darius shook his head. "That's not for people like me." Mark paused. "People like you." Darius looked at him carefully. "People without degrees. Without leverage. Without parents who can float rent when things go bad." Mark nodded slowly. "And people who look like you." Darius didn't smile this time. He didn't need to. The kitchen door swung open. Conversation over. That night, Mark stayed again. This time, he didn't pretend to blend in. He sat on a crate and watched Darius work. "You know this isn't sustainable," Mark said. Darius wiped sweat from his forehead. "Nothing is. You just choose what breaks first." Mark leaned forward. "What broke for you?" Darius hesitated. Then, quietly, "My plans." Mark swallowed. "What were they?" Darius looked at the floor. "Chef school. I wanted to open a place. Small. Nothing fancy. Just honest food." Mark nodded. "You still could." Darius laughed once. Dry. "With what money? With what time?" Mark didn't answer right away. Then, what if time wasn't the problem? Darius studied him again. "You talk like someone with options." Mark met his eyes. "Maybe I am." The room went still. "You should be careful," Darius said. "People don't like hope around here." Mark smiled faintly. "That's usually a sign it's needed." The tension broke the following afternoon, quietly, the way most breaking points do. A supplier missed a delivery. Half the produce order did not arrive. Mason exploded. "This is why I can't rely on anyone," he snapped, pacing the kitchen. "We're already behind." Darius stepped forward. "I can adjust the menu. Cut 2 items. Stretch the rest." Mason spun on him. "I didn't ask for ideas." Darius froze. Then nodded. "Sorry." Mark watched the exchange closely. Mason wasn't angry at the problem. He was angry at losing control. The lunch rush hit anyway. Tickets stacked. Servers hovered. Customers waited. And still, plates went out. Because Darius adapted. Quietly. Efficiently. Invisibly. At one point, a server leaned toward Mason. "Whatever he's doing, it's working." Mason didn't respond. Later, Mark cornered Mason near the dry storage. "You realize he saved that service." Mason scoffed. "That's his job. Without the tools. Without the pay." Mason's eyes hardened. "You're getting real invested for a trainee." Mark held his ground. "I'm invested in the restaurant, not bleeding talent." Mason stepped closer. "You don't know how this works." Mark lowered his voice. "Then teach me." Mason stared at him for a long second. Then walked away. That night, Mark found Darius in the prep room again. "You don't have to stay," Mark said. Darius shrugged. "If I leave it unfinished, it's still unfinished tomorrow." Mark watched him chop. Same rhythm. Same control. "What would you do if you didn't have to prove yourself every day?" Mark asked. Darius didn't stop cutting. "I wouldn't know who I was." Mark nodded. "That's the problem." The reveal was coming, but Mark wasn't ready yet. He needed Darius to speak. Not for the cameras. For himself. On the 4th night in a row, Mark stayed late again. No hood this time. No pretending. Darius finally said it. "You're not scared of getting fired." Mark looked at him. "No. Must be nice." It's not about nice, Mark said. It's about choice. Darius set the knife down. You don't think I choose this? Mark shook his head. I think you were cornered into it. Darius exhaled slowly. My dad worked 2 jobs his whole life. Always said, keep your head down, work harder than everyone else, and they'll notice. Did they? Mark asked. Darius smiled sadly. They noticed he was useful. The words hung heavy. I'm tired, Darius said. But if I stop, I lose everything. Mark leaned against the counter. What if stopping didn't mean losing? Darius looked at him sharply. Don't do that. Do what? Make it sound simple. It isn't simple, Mark said. But it is wrong. Darius stared at the floor. Wrong doesn't pay bills. No, Mark said. But fixing wrong can change systems. Darius laughed quietly. You really believe that? Mark met his eyes. I do. Darius shook his head. Then you haven't been here long enough. Mark glanced at the clock. Or maybe I've been here exactly long enough. Darius studied him again. You talk like someone who's about to drop a bomb. Mark smiled faintly. Maybe I am. The prep room felt smaller. Like the walls were listening. The reveal happened the next morning, not in the kitchen, but in the private dining room. The staff had been told there would be a short meeting before lunch service. Nothing unusual. No cameras visible. No hint of what was coming. Darius stood near the back, arms folded, eyes down. Mason leaned against the wall, relaxed, confident. Mark stepped forward. He took off the hoodie first. Then the beard. The room shifted. Chairs creaked. Someone inhaled sharply. My name is Richard Holston, Mark said. And I own this company. Silence crashed down. Mason's face drained of color. Darius's eyes lifted slowly. Confusion first. Then disbelief. Then something like panic. Richard didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. I came here because this location was underperforming, Richard said. I wanted to understand why. He turned toward Darius. And I found someone working off the clock, night after night, carrying a system that should never rest on one person's shoulders. Mason tried to speak. Richard raised a hand. You approved schedules that relied on unpaid labor, Richard said. Whether you asked for it or benefited from it, the result is the same. Mason swallowed. He didn't deny it. Richard looked back at Darius. Why didn't you say anything? Darius's voice shook. I didn't think anyone would listen. Richard nodded slowly. That's the failure. The room stayed quiet. Cameras rolled now, but the moment wasn't for them. Richard took a breath. Darius, you were accepted into a culinary program. Darius froze. How do you know that? Because you told someone who listened. Darius stared at the floor. I couldn't go. Not then, Richard said. But you still can. Mason looked up sharply. What? Richard didn't look at him. Effective immediately, Darius is promoted to junior line cook. Paid training. Overtime tracked. And the company will cover tuition if he chooses to enroll next semester. The room erupted into murmurs. Darius's head snapped up. That's not real. It is, Richard said. And you'll be paid for every hour you've already worked. Darius's knees buckled slightly. He grabbed the back of a chair. I didn't do it for this, he said. I know, Richard replied. That's why you deserve it. Mason was let go that afternoon. Quietly. No speech. No spectacle. Policies were rewritten within the week. Overtime audits. Anonymous reporting. Mandatory manager training. But the real change happened in smaller moments. Darius no longer stayed late alone. When he made mistakes, he was corrected, not crushed. When he did well, someone noticed. One evening, weeks later, Richard returned, this time openly. "How's the line?" Richard asked. Darius smiled. "Busy." "Fair." "You thinking about school?" Darius nodded. "I start next term." Richard extended his hand. "Proud of you." Darius shook it. "Steady now." "Thank you." "For seeing me." Richard paused. "You were always visible. We just built a place that looked past you." Darius looked around the kitchen. "It feels different now." "That's the point." As Richard left, he glanced back once more. The numbers would improve. They always did when people were treated like people. But that wasn't the metric that mattered. What mattered was that no one had to disappear just to survive. And somewhere between the chopping boards and the quiet nights, a system had finally been forced to listen.